October 25, 1944. Dawn broke slowly over the Philippine Sea as the escort carrier, USS Bay, cut through the calm waters off Samar. The horizon glowed with the faintest thread of orange, the kind of gentle, harmless light that gave men the illusion the day might be peaceful. On the flight deck, sailors wiped down aircraft, tied down loose equipment, and talked quietly to each other in half-whispers. No one suspected that in less than an hour, they would be facing the most powerful battleship fleet Japan had left in the war. A low mist drifted across the surface, clinging to the carrier's hull. Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans, aboard the destroyer USS Johnston, stood near his bridge, scanning the gray horizon with narrowing eyes. He had fought the Japanese long enough to know that silence was rarely safety. Something felt wrong. The air was too still, the sea too calm, the early morning too quiet. He stepped toward the railing, hands gripping the cold steel, and felt a strange heaviness settle in his chest. Aboard the escort carrier USS Gambier Bay, radar operator Leonard McCann stared at his scope and froze. Moving blips. Too many. Too large, too fast. They were coming from the northwest, closing distance at impossible speed. His breath caught. He blinked once, twice, thinking the machine was glitching, but the signal only grew stronger. He swallowed hard. Multiple contacts. Large contacts. Approaching fast. On the bridge, officers turned sharply toward him. How large? Someone demanded. McCann's voice trembled. Sir, battleship large. For a moment, everything went silent except for the hum of machines and the distant whine of carrier engines. Then an alarm ripped through the ship, echoing across the entire task group. Sailors stopped mid-step. Pilots dropped their coffee. Officers rushed to battle stations with pale faces and pounding hearts. Taffy, a tiny cluster of escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts, was never meant to face the biggest guns the Japanese Navy had ever built. They were supposed to be behind the main line, launching air support, not fighting direct naval battles. Their carriers were slow. Their destroyers were lightly armored. Their guns were small. And yet, racing toward them at full speed was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurida's center force, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, including the giant battleship Yamato with guns that could hit targets over 20 miles away. Aboard the USS Hull, the captain stared at the towering columns of water and the distant shell splashes from enemy guns searching the range. The enemy was firing already. The first shells arced high into the sky, glowing faintly before plunging down like falling stars. The sea erupted in white plumes that dwarfed the American ships. Men instinctively crouched, covering their heads. The shockwave trembled through decks and bulkheads. On the flight deck of the USS St. Lo, pilots sprinted toward their aircraft, not waiting for orders. They didn't need them. They knew the rule. If the carriers were caught, they were finished. Planes had to get airborne. They had to scatter, attack, distract, and bite no matter how small their teeth. Above the rising thunder of guns, an officer shouted to the pilots, "Just get in the air! Anything that flies, launch it." Engines roared. Propellers screamed. One by one, aircraft leapt from the deck, disappearing into the dawn haze with bomb racks half empty and fuel tanks barely topped off. There was no time for perfect loads, no time for full armament. Every plane was now a weapon, even if it carried nothing but machine guns and courage. Back aboard the Johnston, Ernest Evans watched the massive splashes creep closer. The enemy had the range. He gritted his teeth. His ship was small, barely more than a steel blade on the water. But it had speed, and it had heart. He knew running would only delay the inevitable. The carriers were too slow. Someone had to make a stand. Evans stepped forward, eyes burning with a resolve so intense it felt like fire. "All engines ahead flank," he commanded. "We're going in." Some of his crew stared at him in disbelief. Charging battleships? With a destroyer? It sounded suicidal. But Evans didn't hesitate. He raised his voice again, steady and absolute. "We've got torpedoes. They've got armor. Let's even it out." The Johnston heeled over as she accelerated, slicing through the waves toward the towering enemy fleet alone. Far behind him, officers on the escort carriers watched the tiny destroyer dash forward and felt something impossible grow inside them. Hope. If one ship could charge, maybe others could fight too. And somewhere on the horizon, for the first time that morning, Japanese lookouts spotted the thin plume of smoke from a charging American destroyer and felt a flicker of confusion. Were these small ships attacking? The sun had barely climbed above the horizon when the Johnston surged ahead, her bow knifing through the rising swells as she raced toward the oncoming Japanese column. Her hull shuddered with every burst of speed. Her guns elevated. Her torpedo crews gripped their equipment with white knuckles. Every man on board knew they were about to fight a battle no destroyer had ever been designed to win. Behind her, two more ships watched the lone destroyer charging into the storm. The USS Hull, the USS Heermann. Both were lightly armored, each carrying nothing more than a handful of 5-inch guns and 10 torpedoes. On paper, they were worthless against battleships. In reality, the men aboard them were made of something the Japanese did not expect: resolve. Captain Leon Kintberger on the Hull scanned the horizon through his binoculars. The Japanese fleet stretched across the sea like a steel wall: cruisers, destroyers, and the immense silhouettes of battleships. Shell splashes erupted around the American formation with terrifying accuracy. The enemy was adjusting fire, step by step, walking the shells closer. He watched the Johnston disappear into the haze of gunfire and smoke. Then he lowered his binoculars. "Helm," he said quietly. "Turn toward the enemy. Follow the Johnston's run." The officer of the deck hesitated only a heartbeat before nodding. "Aye, sir." The Hull pivoted sharply, engines straining as she swung out of formation and accelerated after the Johnston, her deck shaking with the thundering footsteps of sailors racing to their stations. The destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, half the size, half the armor, half the firepower, saw both destroyers moving and made a choice of its own. Lieutenant Commander Copeland slammed his fist on the chart table. "If we don't help them, nobody will." The Roberts turned as well, her small turbines whining as she chased after the larger destroyers. From the flight decks of the carriers, pilots stared at the impossible sight unfolding ahead: 3 American tin cans accelerating directly into the teeth of an entire Japanese fleet. Over the next minutes, the Japanese guns spoke with earth-shaking violence. The giant battleship Yamato fired a full broadside. Her guns erupted in a blinding flash. A moment later, a blast wave tore across the sea as 15 massive shells screamed toward the American carriers, each shell the size of an engine block. Columns of water soared hundreds of feet into the air. Men aboard the carriers were thrown to the deck. One pilot's plane was lifted off its wheels. The message was clear: the Japanese guns could erase the entire task group in minutes. But instead of falling back, the American destroyers pressed harder. As the Johnston approached torpedo range, Evans leaned over the bridge rail, eyes locked forward. Every instinct in him screamed faster, closer, steadier. The ship groaned as she closed the distance, chasing the range needed to make her torpedoes deadly. "Stand by the fish!" he shouted. Below deck, torpedo men steadied their trembling hands as they unlocked the firing safeties. One whispered a quiet prayer. The first Japanese cruiser opened fire on the Johnston with rapid salvos. Shells bracketed her. One struck the bow, tearing metal apart and showering the deck with shrapnel. Men screamed. Evans didn't flinch. "Keep going." The destroyer trembled violently as another shell hit her superstructure, blowing apart antennas and punching through the deck. Smoke billowed into the air. Still she advanced. Evans finally reached the line he needed. Torpedo officers looked at him, awaiting the command. He nodded once. Fire. A rush of compressed air roared from the tubes. 10 torpedoes streaked into the water, leaving long white trails behind them as they sped toward the heavy cruiser Kumano. Seconds stretched like hours. Then the sea erupted in a monstrous blast. A torpedo slammed into Kumano's bow. A plume of water and flame shot skyward. The cruiser staggered, listing to port, smoke pouring from the shattered front of her hull. Her bow had been nearly blown off. She slowed drastically, dropping out of formation. Japanese commanders watched the impossible unfold. A tiny American destroyer had crippled one of their cruisers with a single daring run. The Johnston swung around sharply, her stern barely clearing the edge of a shell splash. She retreated behind a column of smoke, guns firing continuously, refusing to die. The Hull followed with her own torpedo run, braving a torrent of shells as she closed distance with the charging Japanese battleships. The Heermann opened fire next, taking on 3 cruisers at once with her small 5-inch guns, shells ringing out nonstop. Meanwhile, aircraft from the carriers, the last weapon Taffy 3 could offer, began to strike. Avengers swooped low, dropping torpedoes. Hellcats dove from the sky, strafing decks and attacking gun crews. Pilots, low on fuel, made pass after pass with whatever weapons they had left, even if it was just machine gun fire or empty bomb racks. The Japanese commanders watched in disbelief. These small ships were supposed to run. They were supposed to scatter. They were supposed to surrender to overwhelming force. Instead, they were attacking. The giant fleets that were meant to crush Taffy 3 were being bled, slowed, forced to dodge torpedoes and evasive strikes from a handful of thin-skinned ships. Kurita stared at the chaos and felt something unfamiliar creep into his mind. Uncertainty. The Americans were not just resisting. They were counterattacking with a ferocity his fleet had not anticipated. And for the first time since dawn broke over Samar, he wondered if he was walking into a trap. The morning sky over Samar had turned into a shifting maze of smoke, fire, and black clouds as the escort carriers of Taffy 3 fought for their lives. These ships were never meant to battle a fleet. They carried small air groups, Avengers, Wildcats, a few Hellcats, and sailed with the armor of cardboard. Their flight decks shook every time a near-miss shell detonated, and water geysers taller than their masts erupted endlessly around them. But they did not retreat. Aboard the USS Gambier Bay, Captain Walter Vugue felt the deck vibrate beneath his boots. Shells from the Japanese heavy cruisers were walking closer, climbing rung by rung toward the carrier. Smoke flooded the passageways. Alarms wailed. Sailors ran ammunition to gun crews whose single 5-inch guns could do little more than bark at the massive force bearing down on them. Forward lookouts shouted warnings as bright flashes lit the horizon. Another Japanese cruiser had joined the firing line. More shells incoming. The carrier shuddered as a near-miss slammed water against her starboard side, drenching the flight deck and sending steam hissing from the heated metal. Vugue gripped a rail and steadied himself. "Keep the planes flying," he ordered through clenched teeth. Below, on the hangar deck, mechanics worked in a frantic rhythm-fueling aircraft, rearming them, patching holes with whatever scrap they could find. Pilots climbed into cockpits with faces streaked in sweat, smoke, and oil. Some had already flown sorties that morning and were running on fumes, but they didn't hesitate. Commander Clarence "Ziggy" Cyber, one of the flight leaders, tightened his straps and peered across the deck as crewmen pushed his Avenger into position. A shell crashed into the water off the bow, showering the aircraft in spray. A deck officer waved frantically. "Go, go, launch now!" The Avenger roared forward, engines screaming, and hurled itself into the air, barely clearing the distant splash of another incoming round. More planes followed, one after another like birds escaping a burning nest. From above the battlefield, the pilots could see everything the carrier crews could not. The massive shape of the battleship Yamato carving through the sea like a floating mountain. The sleek, deadly silhouettes of cruisers and destroyers pushing forward in formation. And behind them, a sky filled with smoke trails from their guns. Lieutenant Bill Brooks, flying a Wildcat from the carrier Fanshawe Bay, banked hard as he watched the situation below. "This is insane," he muttered. "What are we even shooting at? Those things are armored like city blocks." But there was no hesitation in his hands as he dove. Wildcats raked the decks of Japanese cruisers with machine gun fire. Avengers dropped torpedoes that forced enemy battleships to veer off course. Pilots with no bombs left made dry runs just to distract gunners. Anything to buy the carriers a few more minutes. Back on deck, the Gambier Bay fought to stay in the battle. She tried to maintain distance, turning hard to make herself a harder target, but the Japanese cruisers were relentless. Captain Vugue heard a lookout scream, "Salvo incoming!" He didn't have to look. The carrier shook violently as shells struck home, one punching through the starboard side, causing her to list. Then another. Then a third. Smoke poured across the deck. Engines coughed. She slowed. She was falling behind. On the bridge, officers exchanged grim glances. They knew what a slowing carrier meant. It meant death. Meanwhile, the White Plains, another escort carrier, fired its only real weapon, a single 5-inch gun mounted at the stern. The gun crew worked frantically, firing shell after shell at a Japanese cruiser that was closing dangerously close. Their shells were tiny compared to the monstrous fire being thrown at them, but miraculously, almost unbelievably, one shot found its mark. The 5-inch shell hit the Japanese cruiser Chokai directly in the torpedo bank. There was a deafening explosion. Fire erupted across the deck. The cruiser slowed, coughing black smoke. One tiny escort carrier had just crippled a Japanese heavy cruiser with a weapon normally used for signaling or shore bombardment. Nearby, the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, already fighting like a ship twice her size, charged once more into the fray to draw fire away from the slowing Gambier Bay. Her guns ran hot, her deck blistered, her crew exhausted. But she refused to stop. On the Japanese flagship, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stared at the chaos below him with disbelief. Escort carriers launching constant air attacks. Destroyers charging battleships head-on. Gun crews fighting with unmatched fury. Pilots making suicidal low-fuel strikes. Nothing about this battle matched Japanese expectations. Through the smoke, Kurita could see his fleet taking damage, falling out of formation, losing momentum. And now, his officers, once confident, looked uneasy. This was not the American force they expected to sweep aside. This was something else. Something dangerous. Something stubborn. Kurita leaned forward, gripping the rail of his bridge. Why are they fighting so hard? It was a question no one aboard his flagship could answer. And as the battle raged, another question began to grow in Kurita's mind, a question that would change the course of the entire engagement. If these small carriers and destroyers fought like this, what larger American force waited beyond the horizon? The first aircraft to launch from the small American escort carriers were not sleek fighters or heavy bombers. They were slow, lightly armed Avengers and Wildcats, many carrying only half loads of ammunition because the crews had scrambled so fast. But speed of launch did not matter. What mattered was courage. The sky above Taffy 3 erupted with the roar of propellers as wave after wave of aircraft climbed into the dawn light. Pilots who had been asleep minutes earlier were now banking straight toward the largest Japanese battleships ever built. Some had no bombs, some had no torpedoes, some had empty gun racks. But they still went. The Japanese fleet looked unstoppable. Yamato alone towered like a steel mountain, her guns so large that their shockwaves shredded clouds. And yet against all logic, these tiny American planes dove toward her. The first attack run came from a lone Avenger. The pilot pushed the nose down, engine screaming. He released a single torpedo, watched it streak through the waves, and then ripped his aircraft away as anti-aircraft fire clawed at him. Explosions erupted around him like a storm fire. Another Avenger dove toward a cruiser and opened machine gun fire, knowing full well the rounds couldn't pierce heavy armor. But the Japanese gunners flinched, ducking behind shields. The distraction bought precious seconds for another pilot carrying a real torpedo. Smoke trails cut across the sky. Shell bursts flashed like white stars. The air shook with shockwaves from the battleship's massive guns. From the American escort carriers below, officers watched in disbelief. Their pilots, outnumbered, outgunned, and flying slower planes were forcing the Japanese fleet to lose formation. Every attack, even the ones with no weapons, created chaos. A Wildcat dove straight at a Japanese destroyer. The pilot fired what little ammunition he had left, then continued his dive even as tracers stitched across his wings. The destroyer captain panicked, ordered a hard turn, and nearly collided with a cruiser. Above the smoke and sea spray, one Avenger pilot muttered a single word into his radio as he dove toward the massive guns of Yamato. Charging. His voice did not shake. His wings did. The Japanese commanders, watching through binoculars from their bridges, could not make sense of it. Why would small American aircraft from escort carriers attack a battleship line head-on? It made no tactical sense. It made no logical sense. But it made perfect human sense. Taffy 3 would not run. Taffy 3 would not surrender. Taffy 3 would fight until the sky fell. And in that moment, for the first time, the massive Japanese fleet hesitated. Just for a heartbeat. But hesitation is death in war. The small American planes kept diving, kept firing, kept charging. The battle had only just begun and already, the impossible was happening. The giants were being pushed back by the smallest ships and the smallest planes the U.S. Navy had. And the shock across the Japanese command grew with every passing second. The men of Taffy 3 had already witnessed the impossible in the sky. Now they were about to attempt the impossible on the sea. The order came from the bridge of the destroyer USS Johnston. A single word, sharp, final, charge. The crew stared at their captain, Ernest Evans, a man who believed in action more than survival. Without hesitation, Evans pushed the throttle forward, and Johnston lunged ahead, cutting across the waves at full speed. The sailors felt the deck vibrate under their boots. They heard the boilers scream. They watched the bow lift and slam down against the swells. In front of them waited an entire Japanese battle line. Johnston was a destroyer, thin armor, small guns, fragile superstructure. Yamato was a floating fortress, thick armor, guns that could tear mountains apart. But none of that mattered. Johnston sprinted toward the Japanese fleet like a hunting wolf. Shells the size of cars landed on both sides of her hull. Every impact sent geysers of seawater into the air. One blast shook the destroyer so violently that men thought the ship would split in half. Still, she pushed forward. From the Japanese flagship, officers watched in disbelief. A lone destroyer, a tiny silhouette, was charging directly at them. It made no sense. It was suicide. And yet, it was happening. Johnston's forward guns began firing. Each shot was answered by a thunderous reply from the battleships. A shell crashed through the deck. Sparks exploded, shrapnel slicing across the bridge. Smoke filled the air. But Johnston kept running, her survivors clinging to rails and shouting orders through the chaos. Then came the moment. Johnston turned hard to port, exposing her torpedo tubes. The sea roared past as crewmen armed and fired the torpedoes, long metal beasts that leapt into the water with a hiss and streaked toward the Japanese cruisers. 10 deadly tracks carved through the ocean. Silence followed. Then boom, one torpedo slammed into a Japanese cruiser. The battleship column panicked. Ships swerved out of formation, turrets scrambling to reposition. Johnston turned back toward the enemy, guns blazing, smoke pouring from her funnels like a signal flag of defiance. But she wasn't alone. USS Hull and USS Heermann, the other two destroyers, now joined the charge. 3 small ships against an empire. They weaved through shell bursts, launching their own torpedoes, firing until their guns overheated. Every hit, every explosion, every plume of smoke forced the Japanese commanders to rethink their advance. This wasn't a skirmish. This was a knife fight. The sea vibrated with explosions. The sky darkened with smoke. The Japanese fleet, confident only hours earlier now, struggled to understand what they were facing. How could small, weak ships produce so much damage? How could destroyers attack battleships at point-blank range? How could Taffy 3 refuse to break? The battle line, the most powerful surface fleet Japan ever sent into action, was being slowed, disrupted, pushed off balance. And all because 3 American destroyers had thrown themselves into the mouth of the storm. Taffy 3 wasn't fighting for victory. They were fighting for survival. And in that desperate struggle, they were making history. The ocean around Taffy 3 had become a graveyard of fire and steel. USS Johnston was limping, smoke pouring from her hull like a wounded animal. USS Hull was barely afloat. USS Heermann, the last destroyer, still maneuvering, zigzagged between shell splashes so close they soaked her deck with boiling seawater. Above them, the unending roar of aircraft engines filled the sky as planes from the escort carriers made run after run. Many had no bombs left, no torpedoes left. Some carried only machine guns. And yet, they kept diving. Pilots dropped depth charges they were never meant to use against ships. Some made dry runs, pretending to attack just to keep Japanese gunners looking upward instead of forward. Every second bot mattered. The Japanese commanders aboard Yamato and the cruisers watched this chaos unfold with growing disbelief. Small carriers, tiny destroyers, armed with almost nothing. And still they were fighting like demons. Every few minutes another American aircraft plunged out of the clouds, engines screaming, guns blazing. Smoke trails cut the sky. Anti-aircraft bursts flashed like red stars. Planes limped away with holes the size of fists torn through their wings. Yet they returned, again and again and again. The Japanese admiral, Takeo Kurita, stood on the bridge of his flagship and stared at the burning horizon. He had expected the Americans to flee at the first sight of his battleships. Instead, he found himself facing a force that refused to die. His ships were taking hits from torpedoes, bombs, rockets, and cannon fire. His formation was broken. His timing was lost. And the longer he stayed, the more American aircraft were arriving from distant bases and nearby carriers. He began to doubt what he was seeing. Were these really escort carriers? Were these small destroyers? Was this truly a weak task group or a trap? Reports crackled in. A cruiser hit. Another cruiser burning. A destroyer disabled. More American planes incoming. Then came the message that finally broke his confidence. Enemy carriers spotted behind the horizon. In reality, These were the same escort carriers of Taffy 3, but their silhouettes and smoke made them look like full-sized fleet carriers. Kurita hesitated. If he pushed forward, he might destroy Taffy 3, but at what cost? And what if an entire American carrier group was waiting behind them? Smoke from burning ships drifted across the sea like a curtain. The thunder of American planes only grew louder. Every second, more attacks, more explosions, more chaos. The Japanese fleet kept firing, but the return fire grew wilder, more desperate, less coordinated. And then, without warning, the order rippled through the formation. Reverse course. The most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled turned around and retreated. American sailors on the crippled ships stared across the waves in disbelief. The battleships were leaving. The cruisers were falling back. The destroyers were turning south. The sea grew strangely quiet except for the crackling of flames and the distant hum of aircraft engines. Taffy 3, outgunned, outmatched, outnumbered, had done the impossible. They had forced an entire Japanese fleet to withdraw. On the decks of the escort carriers, wounded pilots were carried below. Some men wept from exhaustion. Others stared at the horizon, trying to understand what they had just survived. No one cheered? Not yet. The cost was too high. Johnston, Hull, Samuel B. Roberts. Ships were sinking. Hundreds were in the water, clinging to wreckage as oil slicks burned around them. And yet, against all logic, all expectation, all probability, the tiny ships of Taffy 3 had changed the outcome of the battle off Samar. They did not win by strength. They did not win by firepower. They won because they refused to run. Their courage forced admirals to retreat. Their sacrifice redirected the course of an entire naval campaign. Their stand became one of the most extraordinary moments in United States naval history. And somewhere in the drifting smoke among the floating wreckage and the twisted metal, one truth remained undeniable. Japanese commanders had never imagined that such small escort carriers, such fragile ships, could crush an entire fleet.